Is
Single
everything
mom
okay?
had only $50 for her first date after 8 years of divorce, shocked when her ex-billionaire approached her table with flowers. A heartwarming and unforgettable love story for my beautiful family. This story will touch your soul and change the way you believe in love. Wait until the very end. The greatest surprise awaits you. Hi, my beautiful family. May the Almighty bless every woman with boundless strength, radiant wisdom, and a heart overflowing with love and compassion. May He honor the mothers who nurture with endless patience, the sisters who guide with gentle wisdom, the wives who stand with unwavering courage, and the daughters who fill our homes with light and joy. May no woman ever feel small, unheard, or unloved, for in God's eyes she is a queen, the soul of every family and the true heartbeat of life itself. Every story I share is written with love, admiration, and respect for you. Stay with me until the end, because your trust is my blessing and your loyalty is my greatest power. If your heart is true, write, present. If your love is real, write, I am with Mr. Peter. Some dreams cost everything you have, and Rose Leslie had exactly $50 to buy hers tonight. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in their cramped two-bedroom apartment, counting the crumpled bills for the fourth time, as if the number might magically increase through sheer willpower. $50. 2 months of skipping lunch at work, walking instead of taking the bus, buying generic cereal instead of the brand Ruby loved. 2 months of watching her daughter's shoes develop holes that she covered with duct tape and colorful stickers, pretending it was a fashion choice rather than necessity. $50 that represented her first chance at love in 8 years, scraped together from a life lived in careful increments of sacrifice. The heating bill could wait another week. The car inspection could be postponed until next month. Tonight was about hope. About the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she deserved something beautiful again, despite the mistakes that had led her to this moment. "Mommy, you look like a princess," Ruby said from the doorway, her 7-year-old eyes bright with wonder as she took in Rose's transformation. Rose had borrowed the black dress from her neighbor Mrs. Chen, a kind woman who'd quietly left groceries by their door more than once when times were especially tight, who understood the pride that prevented asking for help directly. She'd spent precious dollars on drugstore makeup, the cheapest foundation that would blend with her skin tone, mascara that promised 12-hour wear because she couldn't afford touch-ups. Her natural curls had been twisted into something resembling elegance, with bobby pins and prayers, each one carefully positioned to hide the fact that she couldn't afford a proper salon visit in over 2 years. The shoes were her own from years ago, when she'd had a different life, black pumps with a small scuff on the toe that she'd covered with black nail polish. They still fit, though they pinched slightly after years of wearing nothing but practical flats and sneakers that could handle chasing after Ruby and walking long distances when bus fare was needed for groceries instead. In the mirror above Ruby's small dresser, she almost looked like the woman she used to be, confident, hopeful, worthy of love. Before the divorce proceedings that had dragged on for months while she was pregnant and terrified, before single motherhood stripped away every luxury except hope, before she learned to measure her worth in her daughter's happiness rather than her own dreams, before she discovered that loving someone could break you so completely that it took years to remember how to believe in tomorrow. "Thank you, baby girl." Rose stood, smoothing the dress that was slightly too tight, but would have to do, checking herself one more time in the mirror that reflected back a woman who looked almost like her old self. Almost. "Remember what we talked about? Mrs. Patterson next door will watch you until I get back." The conversation they'd had about this evening had been more complex than most 7-year-old discussions. Rose had explained about meeting someone new, about the possibility of friendship, about how sometimes adults needed to try new things even when they felt scary. She'd been careful not to promise anything, not to build hopes that might crumble, but she'd also tried to help Ruby, Understand that this was about more than just one evening. It was about Rose learning to believe she deserved happiness. Again, after 8 years of convincing herself that being a good mother meant sacrificing everything else, Ruby bounced on her toes, her enthusiasm infectious despite Rose's nerves. Her small hands clasped behind her back in the way she did when she was trying to contain excitement that felt too big for her 7-year-old body. Your first date in forever. Are you excited? Are you nervous? Did you remember to put on the perfume sample from the magazine? The one that smells like vanilla and promises? Promises, Rose asked, despite her anxiety finding herself charmed by her daughter's unique way of describing things. That's what it smells like to me. Like someone promising that good things can happen if you're brave enough to try. Excited, terrified, desperate, hopeful, guilty for spending money they didn't have on something as frivolous as hope, as ephemeral as the possibility that someone might see her as worth loving again. Rose had agreed to this blind date only because her co-worker Maya had worn her down with weeks of gentle pressure, showing up at Rose's desk every Monday morning with stories of successful relationships and happy endings. Like fairy tales were real things that happened to real people who deserved more than just survival. Rose, honey, you're 32, not 92, Maya had said just last week, perching on the edge of Rose's desk with a coffee that smelled expensive and a smile that suggested she knew secrets about happiness that Rose had forgotten. Ruby needs to see her mama happy. She needs to know that love is possible, that people can choose each other and build something beautiful together. You've been carrying the weight of the world alone for 8 years. Maybe it's time to let someone help you carry it. But sitting here now, clutching her meager budget and staring at her reflection, Rose wondered if she was being foolish. What kind of future could she offer anyone when she struggled to pay rent on her administrative assistant's salary, supplemented by the small government assistance she'd finally swallowed her pride to accept? When Ruby's shoes had holes she covered with duct tape and claimed were ventilation systems for athletic performance. When their biggest splurge was Friday night pizza from the discount place, and even that required careful budgeting and the sacrifice of something else they needed. Mommy. Ruby's voice pulled her from spiraling thoughts. What if tonight changes everything? Rose knelt to meet her daughter's gaze, struck as always by Ruby's unusual depth. At 7, Ruby possessed an old soul that sometimes unsettled Rose. She asked questions that had no easy answers, observed things adults missed, carried herself with quiet dignity that seemed inherited from somewhere beyond Rose's modest world. More than once, Rose had wondered if Ruby's wisdom came from being forced to grow up too quickly, from watching her mother struggle and learning to read adult emotions because her own security depended on understanding when the grown-ups in her life were overwhelmed. What do you mean, sweetheart? Ruby's small hands straightened Rose's collar with careful precision, her touch gentle but sure. Sometimes I dream about having a daddy. Not just any daddy, but the right one. The one who would love us both and make you smile the way you do when you think I'm not watching and you're looking at old pictures. The words hit Rose like physical blows. She'd worked so hard to be enough for Ruby, to fill every role, to ensure her daughter never felt the absence of the man who'd walked away before he ever knew she existed. But children saw what adults tried to hide, and Ruby's perceptiveness had always been both a blessing and a curse. Ruby, we're a team, remember? You and me against the world. I know. Ruby's smile was patient, understanding, carrying depths that belonged on someone decades older. But teams can get bigger, right? Sometimes they add new players who make everyone stronger instead of taking something away. Rose pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence mixed with the kind of wisdom that came from watching your mother count pennies and pretend everything was fine. You're the smartest little girl in the world, you know that? Smart enough to know when my mama deserves happiness? Ruby whispered against her shoulder. Smart enough to know that being brave enough to try is better than being safe enough to stay scared. 20 minutes later, Rose stood outside Rossetti's Italian restaurant, her $50 feeling heavier in her purse than any amount of money should. The establishment was modest but clean, with red checkered tablecloths and the warm aroma of garlic bread drifting from the kitchen. She'd chosen it carefully after researching online at the public library. Nice enough to make a good impression. Affordable enough that she could actually pay for her meal if her date turned out to be the kind of man who expected women to split the check. Her blind date was supposed to be a successful businessman who'd specifically requested to meet someone genuine and kind. Maya had been mysteriously vague about details, claiming only that he seemed really interested when I described you, and he specifically asked for someone who values family and isn't impressed by material things. Rose checked her phone, a basic model that could text and call but little else. Another casualty of their tight budget. 7:30 exactly. She'd arrived precisely on time, a habit ingrained by years of juggling work schedules and Ruby's needs. By learning that when you lived paycheck to paycheck with small assistance supplements, every minute mattered. Punctuality was free, and she'd learned to excel at things that cost nothing. Perfect attendance at work, never missing Ruby's school events, always being exactly where she said she'd be when she said she'd be there. The hostess, a teenager with bright pink hair and a genuine smile, approached with menus tucked under her arm. "Table for one, honey. Actually, I'm meeting someone. Reservation under Leslie?" Rose's voice carried more confidence than she felt, a skill she'd perfected in business meetings and parent-teacher conferences where she'd learned to project competence even when she felt like she was drowning in responsibilities too large for one person to handle. "Right this way, sweetie." Rose followed her through the restaurant, noting the other diners with the observational skills of someone who'd spent years making quick assessments of people and situations. Couples sharing wine and intimate conversations, families with children who threw Cheerios on the floor without consequence, an elderly man reading a newspaper alone with the contentment of someone who'd learned to enjoy his own company. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that she was using her last $50 to chase a dream that might be foolish but felt like her only chance at something more than mere survival. Her table sat near the window, offering a view of the parking lot where her 15-year-old Honda Civic looked embarrassingly shabby among newer cars. But the car ran, and running was all that mattered when you were a single mother working to build a better life, one careful decision at a time. 8 o'clock came and went. Then 8:15. Rose ordered water and breadsticks, hyper-aware of every dollar this evening would cost, calculating how the expense would affect next week's grocery budget. Maybe he'd changed his mind. Maybe Maya had oversold her qualities. Maybe this was just another reminder that some dreams were too expensive for women like her. "Excuse me, ma'am?" The voice behind her was deep, familiar in a way that made her blood freeze in her veins and her carefully constructed evening collapse into something that felt more like fate than coincidence. Chapter Scene 2: Flowers and Ghosts. The white roses in Chris Brown's hands seemed to mock every careful wall Rose had built around her. Heart. She turned slowly, hoping desperately that 8 years of separation had been enough to make her forget the sound of her own destruction. But time stopped the moment she saw him. Chris Brown stood beside her table, devastatingly handsome in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. The kind of outfit that whispered money and power and success at volumes that made her borrowed dress feel like costume jewelry worn to a play she had no business attending. His green eyes held the same intensity that had once made her believe in forever, that had convinced a 24-year-old woman she could conquer the world with love as her only weapon. And in his hands was a bouquet of white roses, her favorites, though he couldn't possibly remember that detail from their shattered past. But he did remember. She could see it in the way he held the flowers, like they meant something more than mere politeness, like he'd chosen them deliberately rather than grabbing whatever looked expensive at the florist. The realization hit her like cold water. Chris Brown, billionaire CEO, had remembered her favorite flowers after 8 years of separation. 8 years of building an empire, while she'd built a life from the scraps of what they'd destroyed together. "These flowers are for the lady at table 12, Chris continued, his voice catching slightly as his own recognition dawned like sunrise, breaking over a landscape he'd thought was lost forever, like light returning to a world that had been dark for 8 years. "But I think there's been some mistake." Rose found her voice, though it emerged as barely a whisper, fragile as spun glass that might shatter if she spoke too loudly, if she acknowledged too fully what was happening in this moment that felt suspended outside of time. "Chris?" "Rose." He said her name like a prayer and a curse combined, like something sacred that had been broken and might never be whole again, like a word he'd been practicing in private for 8 years without knowing why. "What are you doing here?" The question hung between them, loaded with 8 years of separation, of secrets, of the daughter sleeping safely at home, who had his eyes and her stubborn chin, who carried their DNA in every cell but had never known her father's name. Rose's mind raced, calculating the impossibility of this coincidence, the danger it represented to the careful life she'd built brick by brick from nothing, the threat to the peace she'd finally found in routine and resignation. She'd come here hoping for something simple, dinner conversation with a stranger, perhaps the beginning of friendship, maybe even the distant possibility of companionship. Instead, she'd walked into the past she'd spent 8 years trying to escape, the love story that had nearly destroyed her when it ended, the man who'd given her everything beautiful in her life and then taken himself away before he could see what they'd created together. "I'm waiting for someone," she managed, her hands gripping her purse like a lifeline in a storm that threatened to drown her carefully constructed world. "A blind date." Chris slid into the seat across from her without invitation, setting the roses on the table between them like a declaration of war, or perhaps a white flag of surrender. Rose couldn't tell which. He looked older, more distinguished, the sharp edges of youth softened into something even more dangerous, success wrapped in confidence and expensive tailoring that spoke to 8 years of building the empire he'd chosen over their marriage. His suit was perfectly tailored, cut from fabric that probably cost more than she made in a month, his watch catching the restaurant's ambient light with the subtle gleam of Swiss engineering. Everything about him screamed the wealth and power he'd achieved in their years apart, the life he'd built after choosing ambition over love. But his eyes, those green eyes that Ruby had inherited, held the same intensity that had once made her believe in forever, that had convinced a young woman she was worthy of being loved completely. They also held something she hadn't expected to see, uncertainty, perhaps even vulnerability, as if the billionaire businessman was just as shaken by this encounter as she was. Chris's jaw tightened, and she saw the moment understanding crashed over him like a wave destroying a sandcastle. His green eyes, Ruby's eyes, widened as pieces clicked together in his brilliant mind that had built empires but had never known he'd helped create the most precious thing in either of their worlds. "The reservation, R. Leslie. Someone called my assistant. Said a woman wanted to meet." His voice dropped to barely audible, heavy with the weight of realization. "Rose, who made that call?" Rose's heart stopped as the pieces clicked together with devastating clarity. R. Leslie, Ruby Rose Leslie. Her brilliant, impossible 7-year-old daughter had somehow orchestrated this meeting with the precision of a general planning a campaign, using resources and intelligence that should have been beyond her years, but had always been part of Ruby's remarkable nature. "Oh, God," Rose breathed, her hands trembling as she reached for her purse. "Chris, I have to go." This was a mistake, but before she could stand, Chris's hand caught her wrist, and the touch sent electricity through her entire body. just like it had when they were young and stupid and believed love conquered everything, before they'd learned that love without compatibility could destroy more than it created. Rose, wait, we need to talk. No, we don't. You made that clear 8 years ago when you left for that business trip and never came back. When you let the lawyers finalize everything while you were building your empire on the other side of the world. 8 years ago, I was an idiot who thought success meant sacrifice, who believed I had to choose between love and ambition because I was too young and stupid to understand that the right person makes you better at everything, not worse. And now, Chris's smile was sad and beautiful and devastating, carrying 8 years of regret and hard-won wisdom. Now I'm an idiot who's been leaving flowers for a little girl who reminds me of someone I used to love more than my own life. Rose felt the world tilt as she realized the flowers in his hands weren't coincidence at all, that the universe had been conspiring to bring them back together through the one person who mattered more than their pride or their fear or their carefully constructed separate lives. Chapter 3. The stranger who knew her name. The white roses Chris held seemed to burn with significance as Rose stared at him across the table that had become a battlefield between past and present. "You've been leaving flowers for a little girl?" Rose repeated, her voice hollow with growing dread that felt like ice spreading through her veins. Chris nodded, his eyes never leaving her face, as if he was memorizing her features all over again. As if 8 years hadn't been enough to forget the woman who'd given him the only real happiness he'd ever known. "There's this remarkable child who walks past my office building every day after school, about 7 years old, with the most serious green eyes I've ever seen, and an intelligence that seems far too advanced for her age." Rose's hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles going white as she gripped her purse like a lifeline in a storm that threatened to destroy everything she'd built. Ruby walked that route because the after-school program at her school provided supervision until 3:30. And then she made the carefully mapped 6-block journey to Rose's office building, where she'd wait in the lobby until 5:30, doing homework and charming the security guards with her precocious vocabulary and her ability to discuss current events like a miniature adult. The route Ruby took wasn't random, it was meticulously planned. The safest path Rose could map from school to her office, avoiding busy intersections and staying on well-lit streets with plenty of foot traffic. Rose had walked it with Ruby dozens of times, pointing out landmarks and safe places, teaching her daughter to be independent because she had no choice, because there was no one else to share the burden of keeping their small family safe and fed and hopeful. The first time I saw her, she was sitting on the steps outside my building, reading a book that looked far too advanced for her age, Chris continued, his eyes growing distant with memory that felt both foreign and familiar. It was raining, and she had this tiny umbrella with cartoon animals on it, but she was holding it over the book instead of herself, getting completely soaked to protect the pages from the water. Rose's throat closed with emotion so sharp it felt like swallowing glass shards. She remembered that day with crystal clarity, remembered Ruby coming home drenched and shivering, her clothes soaked through, but her book completely dry. Rose had scolded her for not taking better care of herself, never imagining that someone had been watching, that someone had cared enough to notice her daughter's fierce protection of the stories that transported her beyond their small, struggling world. "She deserves all the kindness in the world," Rose whispered, thinking of her daughter's generous heart, her old soul, her ability to see beauty in small things because large luxuries had never been part of their world, but somehow she'd learned to find magic in library books and pressed flowers, and the way sunlight looked different through their apartment window at different times of day. "I started leaving small gifts," Chris continued, his eyes searching Rose's face for recognition, for understanding, for some sign that she could see the connection he'd felt with their daughter. Nothing inappropriate, just flowers or a book, sometimes a small toy. She's so polite about accepting them, so careful. Always says thank you, sir, like someone taught her perfect manners and respect for kindness, even when it comes from strangers. Rose felt her heart crack as she realized that Chris had been unconsciously drawn to Ruby, that some part of him had recognized their daughter even without knowing who she was. The flowers Ruby had pressed so carefully in her journal, the books she'd read with extra attention, the small toys she'd treasured like precious artifacts, all of them had come from the father she'd never known, but had somehow connected with anyway. "But there's something else," Chris said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to something almost like confession. Something in the way she looks at the gifts like they're treasures, like no one's ever given her anything just because she deserved kindness. It breaks my heart every time I see her face light up over something as simple as a flower or a book. Rose felt tears threatening as she realized that Chris had seen through to Ruby's core, had recognized the careful way her daughter treated every gift as precious because luxury had never been part of their world, because Rose had taught Ruby to find value in small things and to be grateful for every act of kindness because they couldn't afford to take anything for granted. "The strangest thing," Chris said, his voice carrying wonder and confusion, "is that I feel connected to her in a way I can't explain. Like I've been waiting my whole life to meet this specific child. She has these expressions, these little gestures that seem so familiar. The way she tilts her head when she's thinking, the way she bites her lower lip when she's concentrating, the way she holds herself like she's carrying secrets too important to share carelessly." Chris paused, his green eyes studying Rose's face with increasing intensity. "It's like looking at a ghost of someone I should know but can't quite remember. Like my heart recognizes something my mind hasn't figured out yet." Rose's hands trembled as she realized that Chris had been unconsciously recognizing his own genetics in Ruby, seeing himself reflected in their daughter without understanding the connection. His paternal instincts had been drawing him to her, creating a bond that transcended conscious knowledge, pulling him toward the child who was half of him in ways he couldn't comprehend but somehow felt in his bones. "Chris, you need to stop," Rose managed, though her voice lacked conviction because part of her, the part that had watched Ruby press flowers in her journal and treasure every small gift, was grateful that someone had been kind to her daughter, even if that someone was the man who'd broken both their hearts by leaving. "You can't just give gifts to children you don't know. It's inappropriate, is it?" His gaze intensified, and Rose felt exposed, like he could see through 8 years of carefully constructed lies with a single look. "Because something tells me she's not a stranger at all. Something tells me I know exactly who she is." The accusation hung between them like a bridge across 8 years of separation, and Rose felt the weight of secrets that had grown heavier with each passing day, each milestone Chris had missed. Each night, Ruby had asked questions about her father that Rose couldn't answer without revealing truths that might destroy their carefully constructed peace. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. Rose glanced down and felt her blood turn to ice as she read the words that would change everything. "Mommy, I'm coming to check on you. Mrs. Patterson fell asleep and I'm worried. See you soon, Ruby." Rose looked up to find Chris watching her face, and she knew from his expression that he'd seen her panic, had recognized the fear of a mother whose carefully laid plans were about to crumble. "Rose," Chris said quietly, his voice carrying certainty that made her stomach drop. "Who is our Leslie?" Before Rose could answer, movement outside the window caught her attention. A small figure pressed against the glass, breath fogging the surface as she cupped her hands to peer inside with the determined expression of someone who'd made an important decision. "Ruby." Rose's blood turned to ice as she saw her daughter's face light up with recognition, saw the moment Ruby spotted the man sitting across from her mother, the stranger who'd been leaving her gifts, who'd shown her kindness when the world felt too big and complicated. Ruby waved enthusiastically at Chris, her smile bright with innocent joy, and Rose watched 8 years of secrets crumble as her daughter's face appeared like an answer to a question Chris had been afraid to ask. Chapter 4. Recognition. The moment Chris saw the little girl in the window, his entire world shifted on its axis with the force of recognition that hit him like lightning splitting a tree. She pressed her small face against the glass, her breath creating foggy circles as she peered inside with unmistakable excitement. Her green eyes, his eyes, sparkled with recognition as she spotted him sitting across from Rose, and her enthusiastic wave contained a familiarity that spoke of previous encounters, of a connection that transcended the casual relationship between a businessman and a child who walked past his building. But seeing her now, framed in the restaurant window, with Rose's panic painting the air between them, Chris felt reality crystallize into something both wonderful and terrifying. This was his flower girl, the child who'd been accepting his gifts with such careful politeness, who'd stirred something deep in his chest every time their paths crossed. But she was also something more, something that made his heart race and his breath catch as pieces of an impossible puzzle began clicking together. "That's her," he said softly, never taking his eyes off the little girl whose face held features he recognized from his own mirror, whose expressions carried familiar mannerisms he'd inherited from his own father. "That's my flower girl." Rose followed his gaze and made a sound like all the air had been punched from her lungs. Ruby, Ruby. Even her name felt right in his mouth, like something he'd been waiting to say his entire life without knowing it. She wore a pink jacket over jeans that had been carefully mended with patches that turned necessity into art, her dark curls escaping from a ponytail that suggested hurried preparation. Everything about her spoke of a child loved deeply, but raised without excess. Practical shoes with small scuffs that had been polished to hide their age. A backpack with a small patch over one corner that had been decorated with flowers to disguise repair work. The signs were everywhere once Chris knew how to look. The careful maintenance of belongings that couldn't be easily replaced. The way she carried herself with dignity despite modest circumstances. The mature responsibility in her posture that spoke to a child who'd learned early that some things were too precious to take for granted. "She's beautiful," Chris whispered, and meant it with every fiber of his being. This child was beautiful in a way that transcended physical appearance, beautiful in her careful dignity, her serious expressions, her polite acceptance of his small offerings. But more than that, she was beautiful in the way that made his heart ache with recognition, with unconscious love, with the primal pull of genetics calling to genetics across years of separation. Rose was already standing, her face pale with something approaching panic that made Chris's chest tight with concern. "I have to get her. She shouldn't be here alone." But Ruby had already spotted the restaurant's entrance and was making her way inside with determined steps that reminded Chris powerfully of Rose's stubborn independence. He watched her navigate through the dinner crowd with impressive composure for a 7-year-old, apologizing when she bumped into a chair, thanking the hostess who pointed her toward their table with the kind of polite grace that spoke of careful upbringing. The other diners barely noticed the small girl weaving between tables, but Chris couldn't take his eyes off her. She had a presence that commanded attention without demanding it, a natural grace that seemed inherited rather than learned. Everything about her spoke of a mother who taught her to hold her head high regardless of circumstances, to treat everyone with respect, to believe in her own worth even when the world tried to suggest otherwise. Chris watched her approach with growing amazement, noting details that seemed important for reasons he couldn't articulate. This child moved through the world with dignity beyond her years, carrying herself like royalty despite her patched jeans and carefully mended jacket. Her backpack was old but clean, her shoes practical rather than fashionable, her hair neatly braided in a way that suggested morning routines carefully maintained despite limited resources. But it was her eyes that stopped his breath. Green eyes that were exactly like his own, set in a face that blended Rose's delicate features with his stronger bone structure. The resemblance was unmistakable once he knew how to look, once he stopped seeing her as a random child and started seeing her as the impossible answer to questions he'd never known how to ask. "Mommy!" Ruby called out as she approached, but her eyes kept darting to Chris with unmistakable curiosity and something else. Recognition, perhaps, or the satisfied look of someone whose careful plan was finally coming together, whose months of observation and strategizing were bearing fruit. "Mrs. Patterson said you seemed upset when you left, so I came to make sure you were okay." The concern in her voice was genuine, the kind of worry that spoke to a child who'd learned to read adult emotions, because her own security depended on understanding when the grown-ups in her life were struggling. Rose recognized that tone. It was the same one Ruby used when she noticed Rose counting bills at the kitchen table or staring at overdue notices with worry lines creasing her forehead. Rose knelt to Ruby's level, her hands automatically checking for injuries or signs of distress. The maternal ritual of a woman who'd spent 7 years as her daughter's only protection against a world that could be harsh to single mothers and their children. "Baby, you walked 6 blocks in the dark. That's not safe. I stayed on the main streets like you taught me. I brought my whistle and my emergency money." Ruby patted her jacket pocket with pride, demonstrating the independence that Rose had been forced to foster, then turned her attention to Chris with the direct gaze of someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. "Hello, Mr. Brown." The simple greeting hit Chris like lightning, splitting through his carefully constructed understanding of reality. She knew his name. This child knew who he was, had connected him to the flowers, had perhaps orchestrated this entire evening in ways he was only beginning to understand. The intelligence in her green eyes, his eyes, was staggering. The kind of calculated awareness that belonged on someone decades older. "Hello, Ruby," he said gently, testing her name on his tongue and finding it perfect, like a word he'd been waiting his entire life to say. "How did you know my name?" Ruby's smile was mysteriously wise, carrying secrets that seemed too large for her small face, wisdom that felt inherited from some ancient source beyond her 7 years of existence. "I know lots of things, like how you work in the tall building with the green glass, and how you always look sad when you think nobody's watching, and how you drive the same route past the school every day, even though it's not the fastest way to your office." Rose's sharp intake of breath was audible, her face going pale as she realized the depth of Ruby's observations. Her daughter had been watching Chris, studying him, learning his patterns with the dedication of a detective, building a case file. How long had Ruby been planning this reunion? How long had she been carrying the weight of knowing who her father was, while pretending ignorance? "You've been watching me?" Chris asked, his voice a mixture of amazement and concern, wondering what else this remarkable child had noticed, what other secrets she carried in her brilliant mind. "I've been hoping," Ruby corrected with the precision of someone who chose her words carefully, who understood that language had power and meaning beyond its surface. "Mommy taught me that hope without action is just wishing, but hope with observation becomes planning. And I've been planning for a very long time." Chris felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that this child, his child, possessed strategic thinking that would impress adults twice her age, emotional intelligence that most people spent decades developing. Where had she learned such wisdom? How had Rose raised someone so extraordinary while struggling alone against a world that seemed designed to knock down single mothers trying to build better lives for their children? "Ruby, sweetie, we need to go home now," Rose said, her voice carrying an edge of desperation that made Chris realize how carefully she'd been protecting this secret, how much she had to lose if the truth came out in the wrong way. But Ruby remained focused on Chris, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel simultaneously exposed and recognized, like she was reading parts of his soul he'd forgotten existed. "The flowers you gave me were beautiful. I pressed them in my journal like Mommy taught me, and I wrote stories about the kind man who saw me when other people looked right through me." Chris felt his chest tighten with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. This remarkable child had treasured his impulsive gifts, had seen through to his intentions in a way that humbled him completely. She'd taken his unconscious attempts at connection and turned them into something precious, something worth preserving between the pages of a journal like memories too important to lose. "You kept them," he managed, his voice rough with feelings he couldn't name. "All of them. Every flower, every book, every small kindness." Ruby's voice grew soft, with a sincerity that belonged on someone much older. "Mommy says when someone gives you something from their heart, you honor it by taking care of it. And I could tell that everything you gave me came from your heart, even if you didn't understand why." The words hit Chris like arrows finding their target. This 7-year-old had recognized his unconscious love, had understood the paternal instincts that had been drawing him to her before his mind could process what his heart already knew. Rose was watching this interaction with visible distress, her protective instincts warring with something that looked almost like gratitude. "Ruby, we really need to leave. But Mommy, this is the man I told you about. The kind stranger who's been so nice to me." Ruby's voice carried confused innocence as she looked between her parents. "Isn't this wonderful? Now you can meet him properly and see that he's not dangerous at all." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Rose had been worried about a stranger giving her daughter gifts, had probably tried to discourage Ruby from accepting them, never knowing that the stranger was the father Ruby had never met but had somehow been unconsciously seeking. Chris looked at Rose, seeing new layers of her protective instincts, understanding for the first time the impossible position she'd been in. A single mother watching her daughter accept gifts from an unknown man, torn between gratitude for his kindness and terror at his motives, never knowing that the man her maternal instincts warned her about was the same man her daughter needed more than anything. "You've been protecting her," he said quietly, the realization hitting him with the force of understanding. "From me, from everyone," Rose corrected. But her voice lacked conviction, because they all knew this moment was about more than general protection. It was about the specific man sitting across from her, the father who'd left before knowing he had a daughter to protect. Ruby looked between her parents with growing understanding, her 7-year-old mind processing connections that adults tried to hide behind careful words and frightened silences. "Mommy, why do you look scared? Mr. Brown has been nothing but nice to me. Sometimes nice isn't enough, baby. But it's a start, isn't it?" Ruby's question was directed at Chris, and he saw hope in her eyes that made his heart ache with possibility and terror in equal measure. "That's what you always say, Mommy. That kindness is how all good things begin." Before anyone could respond, Ruby's attention was caught by something outside that made her face light up with excitement. But as she turned toward the window, Chris caught her profile in the restaurant's lighting, and the resemblance hit him like a physical blow. The shape of her jaw was his, the set of her shoulders when she was determined, the way she held her head when she was thinking through something important. This wasn't just a remarkable child who reminded him of someone he used to love. This was his daughter, his flesh and blood, the family he'd never known he'd left behind when he'd chosen ambition over love 8 years ago. Chapter 5. When Truth Collides. The camera flash across the street had shattered whatever fragile moment they'd been building. But Chris couldn't let the evening end with Ruby's question hanging unanswered in the air between them. Rose. Wait. He caught up to them in the restaurant's parking lot, where she was fumbling with her car keys beside an aging Honda Civic that had clearly seen better decades, but was maintained with the kind of careful attention that spoke to someone who couldn't afford repairs. "We can't just pretend this didn't happen." "Watch me," Rose muttered. But her hands were shaking too badly to get the key in the lock, her composure finally cracking under the weight of 8 years of secrets threatening to spill into the open. Ruby stood between them, her wise eyes moving from one parent to the other like she was watching a tennis match whose outcome would determine her entire future. "Why is everyone so upset? I thought grown-ups were supposed to be happy when they made new friends." "It's complicated, baby," Rose said, finally managing to unlock the car with hands that trembled despite her determination to appear in control. "Adults always say that when they're being stupid," Ruby observed with devastating 7-year-old honesty that cut through pretense like a blade through tissue paper. "Simple things only get complicated when people make them that way on purpose." Chris almost smiled despite the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. This child was remarkable, far too insightful for her age, far too comfortable navigating adult emotions with the skill of someone who'd been forced to mature beyond her years. Where had she learned such wisdom? How had Rose raised someone so extraordinary while struggling alone? "Ruby's right," he said, his voice carrying conviction that surprised even him. "We are being stupid." Rose spun to face him, her eyes blazing with 8 years of accumulated fury that had been carefully banked but never extinguished. Don't you dare try to use my daughter to manipulate me into having a conversation. I don't want to have our daughter." The words dropped between them like a bomb detonating in the parking lot's fluorescent lighting. Rose went completely still, her face draining of color as the truth she'd been protecting finally hung in the open air between them. Ruby's head snapped up with sudden sharp attention, her green eyes, Chris's eyes, widening as pieces clicked together in her brilliant mind. "What did you say?" Ruby's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 7 years of wondering. 7 years of questions Rose had deflected or avoided. 7 years of dreaming about a father who existed only in her imagination. Chris looked down at this remarkable child who shared his eyes, his stubborn jaw, his apparent tendency toward uncomfortable honesty, and felt the weight of this moment settling over him like destiny, finally arriving after years of delay. He saw Rose's intelligence in Ruby's quick mind, Rose's grace in her careful manners, but his own genetics were undeniable in her bone structure and expressions, in the way she tilted her head when processing complex information. "I said our daughter," Chris repeated, his voice gentle but firm, carrying certainty that made Rose's stomach drop and Ruby's heart race. "Because that's what you are, isn't it, Ruby? You're my daughter." Ruby's eyes went wide, but not with surprise, with recognition, with vindication, with the satisfaction of someone whose carefully constructed theory had finally been proven correct. Like she'd been waiting her entire life for someone to say those exact words. "I knew it," she breathed, her voice carrying wonder and triumph in equal measure. "I knew it the first time I saw you. You have my eyes." "You have my eyes," Chris corrected softly, kneeling to her level so they were face to face. "Among other things." Rose made a sound like a wounded animal, raw pain escaping from somewhere deep in her chest. "Ruby, get in the car. Now." But Ruby remained rooted to the spot, staring at Chris with an expression of wonder and vindication that made his heart ache with love he'd never known he was capable of feeling. "Are you really my daddy?" The question hung in the parking lot air, heavy with 7 years of longing and hope and careful questions that Rose had deflected or avoided. Chris felt the weight of this moment, understanding that his answer would change everything for this brave little girl who'd been carrying the burden of incomplete identity her entire short life. "Yes," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "I'm really your daddy." Ruby's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face as if someone had turned on a light inside her soul. "I knew it," I've been dreaming about you my whole life, and when I saw you leaving flowers, I knew you had to be him. Daddies are the people who see you when other people look right through you. The words hit Chris like physical blows. The realization that his daughter had been unconsciously defining fatherhood by his small acts of kindness. That she'd recognized love in gestures he hadn't even understood he was making. "Ruby!" Rose's voice cracked like a whip, desperation making her sound sharper than she'd intended. "Get in the car this instant." But Ruby was already moving, not toward the car, but toward Chris. She wrapped her small arms around his waist in a hug that nearly knocked him over with its fierce intensity, with the desperate affection of someone who'd been waiting 7 years for this exact moment. "I missed you," she whispered against his suit jacket. Her words muffled, but carrying the weight of a lifetime of unconscious longing. "I missed you so much, and I didn't even know you yet." Chris felt his heart shatter and rebuild itself in the space of a heartbeat. He knelt to return her embrace, holding this precious child who was half of him, half of Rose, and entirely perfect in ways he'd never imagined possible. This was his daughter, his flesh and blood. The family he'd never known he'd left behind when he'd chosen the safety of solitude over the risk of commitment 8 years ago. "I missed you too, sweetheart," he managed, his voice breaking on words that felt like the most important ones he'd ever spoken. "Every day of your life, I've been missing you without knowing it." Rose was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter claim the father she'd hidden from her, watched 8 years of careful protection crumble in the face of Ruby's desperate need for connection. "This is what I was afraid of," she said to no one in particular, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "This is exactly what I was afraid of." Ruby pulled back from Chris's embrace, but kept her small hands on his face, studying his features with scientific intensity, mapping the geography of genetics that had been calling to her unconsciously since birth. "You really didn't know about me?" "I had no idea," Chris admitted, the truth of it hitting him like a fresh wound. "If I had known—" "You would have left anyway," Rose interrupted, her voice bitter with 8 years of accumulated hurt that had crystallized into certainty. "Just like you left me." Ruby's head swiveled between them, her expression growing distressed as she watched the 2 most important people in her world begin to tear each other apart with words meant to wound. "You used to be married to each other?" "Yes," Chris said quietly, his eyes never leaving Rose's face. "Your mother and I were married. We'd loved each other very much, but we made mistakes that hurt both of us." "What kind of mistakes?" Rose laughed harshly, the sound carrying no humor, only pain that had been festering for 8 years. "The kind where your father decided his business empire was more important than his family. The kind where building wealth mattered more than building a life together." "That's not fair, Rose, isn't it? You're the one who said marriage was holding you back from your potential. You're the one who accepted that business opportunity in Singapore that would keep you away for 18 months. You're the one who said a clean break would be better for both of us, so you could focus on what really mattered." The accusations hung between them like swords, each one finding its target in wounds that had never properly healed. Chris felt the weight of his younger self's choices, the way ambition had blinded him to what truly mattered until it was too late to undo the damage. Ruby looked stricken, her joy at meeting her father warring with distress at seeing her mother in pain, at watching the 2 most important people in her world tear each other apart, with words meant to wound decades-old injuries. "Stop fighting," she said, her voice small but firm, carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 7 years learning to navigate adult emotions because her own security depended on keeping the peace. Please stop fighting." Both adults immediately fell silent, recognizing the pain in their daughter's voice, seeing how their anger was affecting the innocent child caught between them like a bridge they were both trying to burn. "I'm sorry, baby," Rose whispered, kneeling to Ruby's level, her own anger deflating like a balloon with a pinhole. "I didn't mean to upset you. Are you going to make him go away again?" Ruby asked, her green eyes, Chris's eyes, filling with tears that made both adults feel like monsters. Because I just found him, and I don't want to lose him already. I've been dreaming about having a daddy my whole life, and now that he's here, you're both acting like that's a bad thing. Rose's face crumpled as she saw the fear in her daughter's expression. The way Ruby was already bracing herself for abandonment, for disappointment, for the adults in her life to fail her again. Ruby, it's not that simple. Why not? He's my daddy. I'm his daughter. You're my mommy. We're supposed to be a family. Ruby's voice carried the logic of childhood, the belief that love should be simple even when adults made it complicated through pride and fear and the weight of old wounds. I don't understand why that has to be hard. Because families don't always stay together, sweetheart, Rose said, her voice thick with exhaustion that came from 8 years of carrying the full weight of parenthood alone. But they can try again, can't they? Ruby looked between her parents with desperate hope, with the faith that only children possessed in the possibility of happy endings. Can't they try to fix what got broken? Chris felt something shift inside his chest, a protective instinct he'd never experienced before. This child was his daughter, his blood, his responsibility, and she was hurting because of choices he'd made 8 years ago. Choices that had rippled forward in time to create this moment of confusion and pain. Ruby's right, he said quietly, his voice carrying conviction that surprised even him. We should try to fix what got broken. Rose shook her head, her face pale with terror that had nothing to do with Chris and everything to do with the vulnerability of hoping for something that could be taken away again. It's too late for that, is it? Because looking at you, at her, at what we created together, I can't believe it's too late for anything. But before Rose could respond, Ruby stepped forward with the determined air of someone who'd made an important decision. Someone who was tired of watching adults complicate simple truths with fear and pride and the weight of history that children hadn't yet learned to carry. I have something to say, Ruby announced, her 7-year-old voice carrying unusual gravity that made both adults turn to her with automatic attention. And I want you both to promise to listen to me really hard before you answer. Chris found himself nodding before he could stop himself, recognizing authority in this child that commanded respect despite her size. Rose looked at her daughter with something approaching awe, seeing wisdom in Ruby's expression that belonged on someone decades older. What's your question, sweetheart? Chris asked. Ruby's green eyes, his eyes, met his directly, carrying hope and determination in equal measure. Will you please try to love each other again, for me? The question hung in the parking lot, like a prayer offered to a universe that might or might not be listening. And Chris realized that his 7-year-old daughter had just asked for the one thing he'd been afraid to hope for since the moment he'd seen Rose in that restaurant. But before either parent could answer, Rose's phone rang with the harsh electronic sound of an emergency, and the spell was broken as surely as if someone had thrown cold water over all of them. Chapter 6. Christmas Shadows. 3 weeks had passed since that night in the restaurant parking lot. 3 weeks of carefully supervised visits and tentative steps toward something that might eventually resemble a family. But now, sitting in Chris's spacious living room while Ruby played with toys he'd bought her, Rose felt the weight of approaching Christmas pressing down like a physical force that made breathing difficult. Ruby had been different since meeting Chris, happier in some ways, but also more withdrawn, as if the joy of finding her father was warring with confusion about why her parents couldn't seem to be in the same room without tension crackling between them like exposed electrical wires. The change had been gradual at first, so subtle that Rose had initially attributed it to the natural adjustment period that came with major life changes. But as the days passed, it became clear that something deeper was affecting her daughter. Something that went beyond the excitement of meeting her father and into territory that made Rose's maternal instincts scream warnings she didn't know how to heed. During Christmas school vacation, Ruby became withdrawn and melancholy in ways that made Rose's chest tight with worry, and filled their small apartment with a silence that felt oppressive rather than peaceful. The vibrant child who usually filled their space with chatter and laughter had been replaced by someone who moved through their home like a ghost, going through the motions of normal 7-year-old life without any of the joy that made Ruby special, that made their modest existence feel rich with possibility. She'd stopped asking for bedtime stories, claiming she was too tired, though Rose could hear her crying softly in her room after the lights went out. Muffled sobs that made Rose's heart break a little more each night as she stood outside Ruby's door, wanting to comfort but not knowing how to fix what was broken. She'd lost interest in her favorite books, leaving them scattered around the apartment unread, like abandoned friends, their colorful covers somehow looking faded and forgotten. Even her beloved art supplies sat untouched on the kitchen table, colored pencils growing dull from lack of use, sketch pads gathering dust because the child who used to draw rainbows and unicorns and families holding hands had lost faith in happy endings. Most telling of all, Ruby had stopped talking about Chris. After the restaurant incident, she'd asked about him constantly for the first few days. When would she see him again? Why couldn't they all spend Christmas together? Whether he'd liked meeting her as much as she'd liked meeting him. But gradually, those questions had faded into silence, as if Ruby had accepted that some dreams were too fragile to survive in the real world, that the fairy tale reunion she'd orchestrated had limits that even her remarkable determination couldn't overcome. Rose watched her daughter's spark dim day by day, feeling helpless in the face of an emotional pain she couldn't fix with bandages or medicine, or the fierce maternal love that had carried them through 7 years of struggles together. She'd tried everything she could think of, Ruby's favorite foods, prepared with extra care, surprise trips to the library where they'd spent so many happy hours, even splurging on a small toy she couldn't afford. But nothing could reach the part of Ruby that was grieving for the family she'd briefly glimpsed and lost again. "Baby, what can I do to help?" Rose asked one gray December morning, finding Ruby sitting by the window staring out at nothing with the kind of hollow expression that belonged on someone who'd lost everything that mattered, someone who'd learned too young that hope could be more dangerous than despair. "I don't know." "Mommy," Ruby replied, her voice small and distant, like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. "I think some things can't be helped. I think some things are just broken and stay broken no matter how much you want them to be fixed." The words hit Rose like ice water, chilling her to the bone. This was her daughter, her brilliant, optimistic, wise beyond her years daughter, talking like someone who'd given up on the possibility of happiness, someone who'd learned that adults were capable of breaking children's hearts without even trying. Ruby was caught between missing the father she'd just discovered and her mother's pain, processing emotions that were too complex for her young heart to handle, while trying to protect the adult feelings she didn't understand but somehow felt responsible for managing. "I see Emma Rodriguez with her mom and dad at school events," Ruby had said the night before, her voice small and careful. "I see Tyler Johnson's parents holding hands at pickup. I see families that work, and I wonder why mine has to be broken when all the pieces are right there, just not put together." Christmas decorations that usually brought Ruby joy, the small tree with handmade ornaments collected over 7 years. The stockings Rose had knitted during her pregnancy, with hands that shook from fear and hope in equal measure. The advent calendar they filled together each year with small treats and bigger dreams seemed to mock them this year. Ruby went through the motions of holiday preparations with mechanical politeness, but without the enthusiasm that usually made their modest celebrations feel magical. The apartment felt smaller somehow, filled with the weight of Ruby's unexpressed disappointment and Rose's growing guilt. Every carefully maintained tradition felt hollow, when Ruby participated with the enthusiasm of someone going through required motions rather than someone genuinely excited about the approaching holiday. "She's been asking questions," Rose said quietly to the empty air, speaking to the ghost of the woman she used to be before motherhood taught her that love could be both the greatest gift and the heaviest burden. "About why we don't all live together, about why families can't just fix themselves, about whether wanting something badly enough can make it true." Rose found herself staring at their Christmas tree, a small, slightly lopsided pine that had been marked down to $5 because of its imperfections, decorated with ornaments made from construction paper and pipe cleaners, and all the creativity that poverty forced you to develop. It should have looked festive, should have brought the same joy it had in previous years when it was just her and Ruby against the world. Instead, it looked lonely, like a symbol of everything they were missing, everything Ruby had glimpsed and lost again when her parents proved too damaged by their own history to give her the simple gift of a family that stayed together. "What do you tell her?" Rose asked herself, the question hanging in the apartment's silence like an accusation. The truth, that sometimes grown-ups made mistakes that couldn't be undone. That love wasn't always enough to overcome the damage people could do to each other when they were young and scared and chose the wrong priorities. That some broken things stayed broken no matter how much you wanted to fix them. But Ruby deserved better than truth that tasted like failure. Ruby deserved the kind of Christmas morning where both parents were there to watch her open presents. The kind of family photos that didn't have empty spaces where important people should be standing. The kind of security that came from knowing the people who loved you had figured out how to love each other too. As Rose sat in the gathering darkness of Christmas Eve afternoon, watching Ruby stare out at snow that was falling like tears from a grey sky, she realized that her careful protection had become another kind of prison. She'd kept Ruby safe from the possibility of abandonment, but she'd also kept her from the possibility of wholeness. And somewhere across the city, Chris Brown was probably sitting in his empty penthouse, surrounded by all the success he'd chosen over family, wondering if the empire he'd built was worth the loneliness that came with it. If the little girl with his eyes was spending Christmas Eve wishing for the one gift he was too afraid to give her. Chapter 7. When Hearts Stop. Christmas Eve morning arrived grey and cold, with the kind of Atlanta winter drizzle that made everything seem muted and melancholy, as if the whole world was grieving for something it couldn't name. Rose stood at her kitchen window watching Ruby pick listlessly at her breakfast, her daughter's usual morning chatter replaced by a silence that had settled over their apartment like fog that refused to lift. For 3 days since the confrontation at Chris's house, Ruby had been different in ways that made Rose's maternal instincts scream warnings she didn't know how to heed. Not angry, not defiant, just diminished. She'd gone through the motions of normal 7-year-old life, school, homework, bedtime routines, but the spark that made Ruby special seemed to have dimmed like a candle flickering in a draught. "Not hungry, baby?" Rose asked, though she already knew the answer. Ruby had barely eaten since their fight, claiming her stomach hurt, or she was too tired, or the food didn't taste right, pushing meals around her plate without taking more than a few obligatory bites. Ruby shook her head, using her fork to create patterns in her scrambled eggs without lifting them to her mouth. "My tummy feels funny, like it's full of butterflies that are all flying in the wrong direction." Rose felt the familiar spike of maternal anxiety that had been her constant companion for 3 days, the kind of bone-deep worry that made it impossible to focus on anything except the well-being of the small person who was her entire world. She'd taken Ruby to the pediatrician yesterday, but Dr. Martinez had found nothing physically wrong. Good vitals, no fever, no signs of illness. Just a little girl who seemed to be carrying too much weight in her small heart. "Maybe some toast," Rose suggested, though she knew Ruby would decline. Every offer of food had been met with the same polite refusal, the same distant expression that suggested Ruby was somewhere far away, processing thoughts too complex for her young mind to handle alone. "I'm not hungry, Mommy." Rose knelt beside Ruby's chair, studying her daughter's face with the intensity of someone searching for clues to an impossible puzzle. The bright intelligence that usually shone in Ruby's green eyes seemed clouded, like she was looking at the world through glass that had been fogged by breath and tears. "Ruby, talk to me. What's really wrong?" Ruby was quiet for a long moment, her small fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth with the careful precision of someone trying to make sense of chaos through repetitive motion. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft, Rose had to strain to hear it. "I made everything worse, didn't I?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "By asking you and Daddy to try to love each other again. I made you both sad, and now everyone's unhappy instead of just me." Ruby's words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them back until they finally burst free from the pressure building inside her small chest. Rose felt her heart crack like glass under sudden pressure. "Oh, baby, no. You didn't make anything worse. Then why haven't I seen Daddy in 3 days? Why do you look like you're going to cry all the time? Why does everything feel broken when I was trying to fix it?" The questions hit Rose like arrows finding their target with devastating accuracy. She'd been so caught up in her own emotional turmoil, so focused on protecting herself from the vulnerability of hoping for something that could be taken away, that she hadn't realized how her stress was affecting Ruby and Chris. She'd asked him to give them space after Ruby's emotional breakdown, claiming they all needed time to process what had happened. But from Ruby's perspective, her father had simply disappeared again, vanishing just when she'd finally found him. "Daddy and I are just figuring things out. That's what adults say when they're giving up," Ruby said, with devastating accuracy that made Rose realize her daughter understood far more about adult emotions than any 7-year-old should have to. Before Rose could respond, Ruby suddenly went very still, her face going pale as paper. "Mommy, I don't feel good." "What kind of not good?" Like everything's spinning and my heart is beating too fast, and I can't catch my breath." Rose reached for Ruby, just as her daughter's eyes rolled back and she slumped forward in her chair, her small body going completely limp like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Rose caught her before she could fall, Ruby's weight feeling both too heavy and too light at the same time, as if she were already slipping away into some place where maternal love couldn't follow. "Ruby. Ruby, baby, wake up." But Ruby didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale and clammy, her body frighteningly still in a way that made Rose's world narrow to nothing but the weight of her unconscious daughter in her arms and the sound of her own heart hammering against her ribs, with terror so pure it felt like drowning. Rose's hands shook as she dialed 911, Ruby's limp body cradled against her chest like a broken bird, her daughter's weight feeling both too heavy and too light at the same time, as if Ruby were already slipping away from her into some place where maternal love couldn't follow, where all of Rose's fierce protection meant nothing against whatever was stealing her child from her. The operator's calm voice seemed to come from very far away as Rose answered questions about Ruby's age, her symptoms, her medical history, all while her own heart hammered against her ribs with terror so pure it felt like drowning in ice water that filled her lungs and made thinking impossible. The questions came in rapid succession, each one making the situation feel more real, more terrifying. How long has she been unconscious? Has she been ill recently? Any changes in behavior or appetite? Any head injuries? Any medications? Rose answered as best she could through her panic, trying to remember details that seemed important but felt impossible to organize when her entire world had narrowed to the weight of her unconscious daughter in her arms. "Ma'am, I need you to check if she's breathing normally." Rose pressed her ear to Ruby's chest. relief flooding through her as she heard the steady rhythm of her daughter's heartbeat. But Ruby's skin felt clammy and too pale, her usual vibrant energy completely absent in a way that made Rose's maternal instincts scream danger like a fire alarm in the night. This wasn't sleep, wasn't exhaustion. This was something deeper, something wrong, something that spoke to damage Rose couldn't see but felt in every cell of her body. She's breathing, but it's shallow. She won't wake up. She just collapsed while we were talking, just crumpled like someone cut her strings. Rose's voice broke as guilt crashed over her like a tidal wave. The realization that she'd been so focused on her own emotional turmoil that she'd missed the signs of her daughter's distress. She's been so tired lately, not eating much, and I thought she was just adjusting to meeting her father. I didn't realize something was really wrong. I failed her. I failed to protect my own daughter from pain I caused. The ambulance is on its way, Mom. They should be there in less than 5 minutes. Stay on the line with me. But Rose barely heard her because all of her attention was focused on Ruby's face, so pale and still, her usual animation completely absent, her brilliant mind locked away somewhere Rose couldn't reach. This was her worst nightmare made real, something happening to Ruby, losing the most important person in her world, being unable to protect the daughter who was her entire reason for existing, for fighting, for believing tomorrow could be better than today. The paramedics arrived within minutes, professional and efficient, as they checked Ruby's vitals and loaded her onto a stretcher, their calm competence a stark contrast to Rose's barely contained hysteria. Ruby looked impossibly small against the white sheets, her dark curls spread across the pillow like shadows against snow. Has she been under any unusual stress lately? The lead paramedic asked as they loaded Ruby into the ambulance, the question hitting Rose like an accusation. Rose's laugh was bitter and self-recriminating, the sound of someone who just realized how badly she'd failed at the one job that mattered most. You could say that. Her parents have been acting like children, and she's been trying to fix us, while we've been too selfish to see what it was doing to her. At the hospital, Ruby was whisked away for tests, while Rose paced the waiting room like a caged animal, her phone clutched in her trembling hands. The fluorescent lights felt harsh and judgmental, the institutional smell of disinfectant and fear making her nauseous with memories of the last time she'd been in a hospital. 8 years ago, giving birth to Ruby alone, while Chris was building his empire on the other side of the world. She should call someone, her sister, her mother Mrs. Patterson, who'd been watching Ruby when this nightmare began. But the only person she wanted to call was the one person she'd been avoiding for 3 days. The man whose reappearance had triggered this entire crisis, but who also had the right to know that their daughter was unconscious in a hospital bed, fighting a battle that shouldn't exist in someone so young. Chris Brown, who had the right to know that the daughter he'd just discovered was lying in a hospital bed because her parents had been too damaged by their own history to give her the one thing she needed most, the security of knowing they could love each other, without destroying everything in the process. Chapter 8. The Father's Desperation. Chris received the call about Ruby's hospitalization while in the middle of a board meeting, surrounded by executives discussing quarterly projections and market expansion strategies that suddenly felt as meaningless as dust in the wind, as irrelevant as yesterday's newspaper in the face of what really mattered. Rose's voice on the phone, broken, terrified, barely coherent through her panic, cut through 8 years of careful distance and hit him with the force of a physical blow that left him reeling, unable to process anything beyond the words Ruby and hospital and unconscious. She collapsed, Chris. She won't wake up. The doctors don't know what's wrong, and I'm scared. I'm so scared I can't breathe. She's just lying there, and she looks so small, so fragile, and I don't know what to do. The words hit him like bullets, each one finding its target in the part of his chest where a father's heart had been awakening over the past 3 weeks. His daughter was unconscious in a hospital, And he'd been sitting in a boardroom discussing profit margins while she was fighting for her health. He'd left the conference room without a word of explanation, ignoring the shocked faces of his board members who'd never seen their unflappable CEO abandon a meeting, walking out on presentations that had taken months to prepare, abandoning million-dollar decisions as if they were nothing more than paper scraps in the wind. His assistant tried to stop him, calling after him with reminders about appointments and obligations that had seemed important an hour ago, but now felt like meaningless noise interfering with his need to reach his daughter. In the elevator down to the parking garage, Chris felt something inside his chest crack open, a protective wall he'd built around the part of him that belonged to Rose and the daughter he'd never known he had, the part of him that had been bleeding for 8 years without his conscious knowledge. He'd thought that wall was protection, but now he realized it had just been a dam, holding back an ocean of love he'd never allowed himself to feel. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of red lights and desperate prayers to a God he'd stopped believing in years ago, when success had become his religion and money his only faith. He'd built an empire worth billions, had commanded respect in boardrooms around the world, had been featured on magazine covers as one of the most powerful men in America. But none of that mattered when faced with the possibility of losing a daughter he'd just found, a child he'd been unconsciously searching for in every little girl's face for 7 years, without understanding why his heart ached whenever he saw fathers with their daughters. By the time he burst through the emergency room doors like a man possessed, his hair disheveled and his shirt wrinkled from being thrown on in haste, his tie askew and his usually perfect composure completely shattered, Chris had never felt more powerless in his entire life. All his wealth, all his influence, all his carefully constructed success meant nothing against the possibility of Ruby's pain, against the reality that love made you vulnerable in ways that money could never protect against, that being a father meant your heart lived outside your body in someone too precious to lose. Where is she? What happened? The words tore from his throat as he spotted Rose pacing the waiting area like a wounded animal, her face ravaged by hours of fear and self-recrimination. Rose stood on unsteady legs, her face showing the wear of someone who'd been put through an emotional blender. She looked like someone who'd been sitting in uncomfortable chairs for hours, clutching at hope like a lifeline, while watching medical professionals try to figure out what was wrong with the most important person in her world. She was eating breakfast, said she felt funny, and then she just collapsed. She won't wake up. Chris, they've run every test they can think of, and they can't find anything physically wrong. But she's just lying there like she's given up on everything. Chris pulled Rose into his arms without thinking, and she let him, too scared and emotionally drained to care about maintaining distance or protecting herself from further heartbreak. For a moment, they were just two terrified parents holding each other while their daughter's life hung in the balance, their 8 years of separation meaningless in the face of shared fear for the child they'd created together. "She's going to be okay," Chris whispered into Rose's hair, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo that he'd tried to forget for 8 years. "Ruby's strong. She's going to be okay." But Rose heard the fear beneath his reassurances, the same terror that was clawing at her own chest with razor-sharp talons. They were both desperate to believe their own words, to will their daughter back to consciousness through sheer parental determination and the kind of love that felt strong enough to move mountains but seemed helpless against whatever was, keeping Ruby locked away from them. "This is my fault," Rose whispered against his shirt, the expensive fabric soft beneath her cheek. "I kept her from you for 3 days because I was scared of getting hurt again, because I was more worried about protecting myself than protecting her from the pain of watching us be afraid of each other." "No." Chris's voice was firm, his arms tightening around her with desperate strength. This is our fault, both of us. We were so busy protecting ourselves that we forgot to protect her from the fallout of our own damage. They were forced to sit together through the longest night of their lives, their anger giving way to shared fear for Ruby, their pride meaningless when faced with the possibility of losing the most important person in both their worlds. Slowly, tentatively, they began talking about their daughter, about the years Chris had missed, about Rose's struggles as a single mother, about their regrets and fears, and the love they both felt for the remarkable child lying unconscious down the hall. "She asked me 3 days ago if I would try to love you again," Chris said quietly, as they sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs that had become their world for the past 6 hours. "And I realized that I never stopped loving you, Rose. I just got really good at pretending I didn't." Rose looked at him through exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, through the kind of emotional depletion that came from holding vigil over your child's bedside. "I never stopped either. I just got scared that loving you meant losing everything again. What if this time we don't lose anything? What if this time we fight for what matters instead of running away when it gets difficult?" Before Rose could answer, Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the treatment area, her expression serious but not panicked. She was a small woman with kind eyes and steady hands, the kind of doctor who radiated competence and compassion in equal measure. Rose and Chris both jumped to their feet, hands instinctively reaching for each other in their shared terror. "Ruby is stable," Dr. Chen began, "but I need to ask you some questions about her emotional state recently. Has she been under any unusual stress? Changes in routine, family dynamics, sleep patterns?" "Her emotional state," Rose repeated, her voice hollow with dread that came from maternal instincts that was screaming warnings she didn't want to acknowledge. Dr. Chen consulted her chart, her expression thoughtful and concerned. "The tests show no physical abnormalities, no infections, no neurological issues, no metabolic problems, no cardiac irregularities. Her blood work is perfect, her brain scans are normal, her reflexes are appropriate for her age. But Ruby is exhibiting signs of severe emotional distress that have manifested in very real physical symptoms." Chris frowned, his business mind struggling to process medical terminology that felt too clinical for their daughter's condition. "What does that mean exactly?" Dr. Chen's expression was gentle but firm, the look of someone who'd delivered difficult news to parents before and understood the weight of what she was about to say. "It means your daughter's heart is breaking, literally. The stress hormones from prolonged emotional distress can cause physical symptoms in children: fainting, fatigue, loss of appetite, even cardiac irregularities. We call it broken heart syndrome, and while it's rare in children, it happens when emotional trauma becomes too overwhelming for a young system to handle." The diagnosis hit Rose like a physical blow, the realization that Ruby was unconscious in a hospital bed because her parents couldn't figure out how to love each other without destroying everything in the process. "Are you saying she's sick because she's sad?" "I'm saying she's experiencing what we call stress cardiomyopathy. It's a real medical condition where emotional trauma manifests in physical symptoms," Dr. Chen explained patiently. "In Ruby's case, the stress of watching her parents struggle to reconnect has created a level of anxiety and emotional distress that her young system couldn't handle." The words landed like accusations, and Chris felt the full weight of what their fear had done to their daughter. Ruby was literally heartbroken because her parents had been too afraid of their own pain to consider hers. "What does she need?" Chris asked, his voice hoarse with guilt and desperation. Dr. Chen looked between them, her expression knowing and kind. "She needs emotional stability. She needs to know that her family isn't going to fall apart again. And most importantly, she needs her parents to stop putting their own fears above her well-being." The words were delivered without judgment, but they landed like accusations anyway. Rose and Chris had been so busy protecting themselves from potential heartbreak that they'd broken their daughter's heart instead. "Can we see her?" Rose whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's awake now, asking for both of you." As they followed Dr. Chen toward Ruby's room, Chris caught Rose's hand, stopping her in the hallway under fluorescent lights that made everything look stark and unforgiving. "Rose, we have to fix this. Not for us, for her." Rose looked at him through tears she'd been holding back for hours, seeing her own devastation reflected in his eyes. "I don't know how to trust you again. I don't know how to risk everything for something that might not work." "Neither do I," Chris admitted, his honesty cutting through the careful politeness they'd maintained for weeks. "But we have to try. Because Ruby deserves parents who are brave enough to fight for her happiness, even when fighting feels impossible." Rose nodded, squeezing his hand as they walked toward their daughter's room, both of them understanding that Ruby's collapse had forced them to confront the truth they'd been avoiding. Their daughter needed them to be brave enough to rebuild what they'd broken, because some things were too important to lose twice, and some loves were worth the risk of having your heart broken all over again. Chapter 9. A Child's Wisdom. Dawn light filtered through the hospital room windows as Ruby stirred awake, her color already better after 12 hours of sleep and the emotional relief that came from seeing her parents in the same room, without the careful distance that had characterized their interactions for weeks. Chris had spent the night in an uncomfortable chair beside her bed, while Rose had dozed fitfully in the recliner, neither parent willing to leave their daughter alone, even for the few hours it would take to go home and change clothes. They'd maintained a vigil that spoke to shared guilt and shared love in equal measure. "Mommy? Daddy?" Ruby's voice was stronger now, clearer, more like the vibrant child they both knew and loved. The word "daddy" still sent electricity through Chris's chest. Still felt like a gift he didn't deserve, but would treasure for the rest of his life. "We're both here, sweetheart," Rose said, immediately moving to check Ruby's forehead for fever, her maternal instincts still on high alert despite the doctor's reassurances that the worst had passed. Ruby smiled, a real smile this time that transformed her entire face and made both parents realize how much they'd missed her joy over the past few days. "I feel better. Like a heavy rock got lifted off my chest, and I can breathe all the way down to my toes again." Chris felt his own chest loosen at her words, relief flooding through him as he realized that their promise to try had already begun healing whatever had been breaking inside her small heart. Dr. Chen had been right. Ruby's physical symptoms had been manifestations of emotional distress, and their commitment to working together had already started the healing process. "Are you hungry?" Rose asked, her voice carrying the hope of someone who'd watched her daughter refuse food for days. "The nurse said you could have real food this morning if you felt up to it." Ruby nodded eagerly, her appetite returning with her improved mood. "Can I have pancakes?" "The kind Daddy makes that are all wonky shapes and taste like he put extra love in the batter." Chris laughed, remembering their disastrous breakfast attempt weeks ago when he'd been trying so hard to impress his newly discovered daughter that he'd managed to burn pancakes while simultaneously undercooked them. "I think the hospital might have better pancake skills than I do, sweetheart. But yours are more fun," Ruby said matter-of-factly, her wisdom shining through in ways that consistently amazed both parents. "Sometimes imperfect things are better because they have more personality and show that someone was trying really hard to make you happy." The statement hung in the air, and Chris caught Rose's eye over Ruby's head, both of them recognizing that their daughter had just delivered profound wisdom about love and effort and the value of trying, even when the results weren't perfect. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand, her expression pleased as she took in Ruby's improved appearance, and the sight of both parents flanking their daughter's bed like guardians who'd finally figured out they were on the same team. "Well, someone looks much better this morning. I feel like myself again," Ruby announced with the confidence of someone who'd weathered a storm and emerged stronger. My parents promised to try to love each other again, and it fixed the broken feeling in my chest. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly, but her smile was warm and knowing. That sounds like very good medicine indeed. The best kind, Ruby agreed solemnly. Her 7-year-old wisdom, cutting straight to the heart of complex adult emotions with the clarity that only children possessed. After Dr. Chen completed her examination and declared Ruby well enough to go home later that day, Rose stepped into the hallway to handle discharge paperwork, leaving Chris alone with their daughter for one of the first times since he'd discovered her existence. Ruby studied him with those penetrating green eyes that were so like his own, her expression thoughtful in the way that always made adults slightly uncomfortable, because it suggested depths that shouldn't exist in someone who still lost teeth and believed in birthday wishes. "Daddy, can I ask you something important?" "Anything, sweetheart." Ruby shifted in her hospital bed, arranging herself cross-legged like she was settling in for the most important business meeting of her life, her small face serious with the gravity of what she was about to discuss. "When you and Mommy were married before, what was the best part? Not the fancy things or the big house. What made your heart feel happy in a way that nothing else could?" The question caught Chris off guard in its specificity and emotional intelligence. He'd been expecting inquiries about their promise to try again, not reflections on their past happiness delivered with the precision of a therapist conducting an intake session. "The best part," he repeated, thinking back to memories he'd tried to bury for 8 years, sorting through the pain to find the joy that had been real, even if it hadn't lasted. "I think it was the way your mother saw me. Not the businessman everyone else saw, not the success story or the net worth, but the real me underneath all that. She saw the parts of me I was afraid to show anyone else, my doubts, my dreams, my terrible jokes that made her laugh even when they weren't funny." Ruby nodded like this made perfect sense, filing away his answer for future reference with the methodical precision Rose used in business negotiations. "She still sees you that way. How do you know?" Ruby's smile held secrets that seemed too large for her small face, wisdom that felt inherited from some ancient source beyond her 7 years of existence. "Because of how she looks at you when she thinks no one's watching, like you're still the most important person in her world. But she's scared to admit it because admitting it means risking everything all over again." Chris felt his heart skip at the accuracy of his daughter's observation. "Ruby, you're 7 years old. How do you see these things that adults miss?" Ruby's smile was mysteriously wise, carrying depths that shouldn't exist in someone who still needed help tying her shoes and remembering to brush her teeth before bed. "Because I'm made of both of you. I have your eyes and her heart, your stubbornness and her strength, your way of seeing through problems and her way of solving them. So I understand both of you better than you understand yourselves." The statement was delivered with such matter-of-fact confidence that Chris could only stare at his remarkable daughter, wondering how he and Rose had created someone so wise, so perceptive, so emotionally intelligent at an age when most children were still figuring out basic social interactions. "What else do you understand?" "That you're both afraid of the same thing," Ruby said, her voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher explaining something obvious to a slow student. "You're afraid that if you love each other again and it doesn't work out, you'll hurt me. But what you don't realize is that not trying hurts me worse than failing ever could, because it means you think I'm not worth fighting for." Chris felt the truth of her words settle into his bones like wisdom he should have possessed all along. They'd been so focused on protecting Ruby from potential future pain that they'd ignored the very real pain their distance was causing her in the present moment. "You're right," he said quietly, humbled by his daughter's insight. "I know." Ruby's matter-of-fact tone made him smile despite the emotional weight of their conversation. "Daddy, can I tell you a secret? A really important one that might help you understand why this matters so much to me." "Of course, sweetheart." Ruby leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially, even though they were alone in the room. "I've been planning this for a long time. Bringing you and Mommy back together wasn't just a wish, it was a project," Ruby continued, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose careful work had finally paid off, whose strategic thinking had achieved results that adults had failed to accomplish with all their education and experience. Her words carried the weight of months of observation, of a child who'd taught herself to understand adult psychology because she needed to engineer a miracle that the grown-ups in her life couldn't see was possible. Ruby had been running a campaign more sophisticated than most corporate mergers, orchestrating a reunion that required understanding human nature, logistics, timing, and the delicate art of bringing two wounded hearts close enough to remember why they'd loved each other in the first place. Chris stared at his daughter in amazement, realizing that this 7-year-old possessed strategic thinking skills that would impress business executives twice her age, emotional intelligence that most people spent decades developing. She'd been conducting psychological research, relationship analysis, and tactical planning while simultaneously maintaining the facade of a normal child dealing with homework and playground politics. "How long have you been planning this? I found old pictures of you two together in Mommy's closet, hidden behind her business awards like secrets she couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bear to throw away," Ruby said, her voice growing soft with longing that seemed too deep for someone so young, too profound for a child who should be thinking about toys and games rather than family reconstruction. Ruby's voice grew stronger, more confident as she revealed the depth of her observations, the sophistication of her emotional archaeology. "I wanted to know what it felt like to have parents who looked at each other that way, who loved each other enough to create something beautiful together, who chose each other every day instead of just existing in the same space. I studied those pictures like textbooks, learning how happy people held hands, how they smiled at each other, how they stood close like they belonged together." Chris felt his chest tighten with emotion as he realized his daughter had been carrying such deep longing, such sophisticated planning, all while maintaining the facade of a normal 7-year-old dealing with normal 7-year-old problems like math homework and playground politics and learning to navigate friendships. Ruby's revelation hit him like lightning. The understanding that she'd been the architect of their reunion, the engineer of their second chance, the child wise enough to see what the adults had forgotten, that some loves were worth fighting for, even when fighting felt impossible, even when the odds seemed insurmountable, even when everyone else had given up hope. Ruby, that's a lot of responsibility for someone your age to take on. "Someone had to," Ruby said simply, her words carrying the weight of a child who'd been forced to be the adult in situations where the actual adults had forgotten how to function. "You and Mommy were too scared to try, so I had to help you remember how." "Remember how to what?" "Remember how to be brave for love," Ruby said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite being afraid. "Remember that some things are worth the risk of getting hurt, because the alternative is staying broken forever." As Rose returned to the room with discharge papers in hand, Ruby looked between her parents with determination that reminded Chris powerfully of Rose's business negotiations. The same confidence, the same refusal to back down from what she believed was right. "I have conditions," Ruby announced, her small voice carrying the authority of someone who just saved her parents' relationship and knew it. Both adults exchanged glances, recognizing Ruby's serious voice and understanding that their remarkable daughter was about to negotiate the terms of their second chance at happiness. Chapter 10. Love Rebuilt from Ashes. 6 months later, Rose stood in the kitchen of Chris's house, their house now, a concept that still felt miraculous rather than mundane, watching through the window as her husband pushed Ruby on the swing set he'd installed last month, with the determined enthusiasm of a man making up for lost time. The word husband still felt new on her tongue, still carried the weight of 8 years of separation and the miracle of second chances that most people never received. But it also felt right in a way that surprised her daily, like putting on clothes that fit perfectly after years of wearing things that were too tight or too loose. Ruby's laughter carried on the summer air, pure and joyful in a way that made Rose's chest tight with gratitude for every moment that had led them to this place. This was what happiness looked like, not the careful arrangement of successful lives lived in parallel, but the messy, beautiful reality of a family that had been broken and rebuilt stronger than before. The kitchen around her bore evidence of their blended life. Ruby's artwork covering the refrigerator in a riot of color and creativity, Chris's coffee mug beside her teacup on the counter, a grocery list written in 3 different handwritings as each family member added their requests. It was domestic in the most wonderful way, the kind of ordinary magic that people who'd never lost everything might take for granted. "Mommy!" Ruby called from the swing, her voice carrying across the yard with infectious enthusiasm. "Come push me too. Daddy's getting tired, and I want to go high enough to see the whole world." Rose dried her hands on the dish towel, a blue one with yellow flowers that Ruby had picked out during their first shopping trip as a reunited family, and headed outside, marveling at how natural this felt now. The careful distance she and Chris had maintained for months had gradually dissolved into something that felt like home, real touches, spontaneous kisses, shared looks across the dinner table that said more than words ever could. They'd learned to love each other differently this time, with the wisdom that came from understanding how precious and fragile happiness could be. Their love was deeper now, tempered by loss and strengthened by choice, built on the foundation of knowing they'd survived losing each other once and never wanted to experience that particular devastation again. "Higher, Daddy!" Ruby demanded, her green eyes sparkling with mischief inherited from both parents. "Any higher and you'll end up in orbit," Chris protested, but he pushed harder anyway, unable to deny their daughter anything that made her smile. Rose watched them together, her heart full to bursting. Chris had thrown himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to everything else, but tempered with a gentleness that took her breath away. He'd learned Ruby's bedtime routine, memorized her favorite foods, could braid her hair almost as well as Rose could, and had mastered the art of making pancakes in shapes that delighted rather than dismayed. As they settled around the kitchen table with milk and cookies later, Ruby slipped between her parents with the casual grace of someone who'd never doubted her place in their world, taking both their hands in hers. It was a gesture she'd started months ago, her way of literally keeping them connected, of ensuring that the family she'd worked so hard to build stayed together. "I have something to tell you both," Ruby announced, her voice carrying the gravity she reserved for important announcements. Rose felt familiar anxiety spike, though it was gentler now, tempered by months of learning that Ruby's announcements were usually cause for celebration rather than concern. "What is it, sweetheart?" Chris asked. Ruby took a deliberate bite of her cookie, chewing thoughtfully before answering with the dramatic timing of someone who understood the power of anticipation. "I've been thinking about the new baby." Rose nearly choked on her milk. They'd told Ruby about the pregnancy just last week, barely 12 weeks along, but unable to keep the secret from their perceptive daughter any longer. "What about the baby?" Rose managed. "Well, I asked for a brother, remember? When I was in the hospital and made that wish about wanting one more family member." "You did," Chris confirmed, his eyes twinkling with amusement at where this might be heading. "And now I'm getting one," Ruby continued with satisfaction that spoke to someone whose plans consistently came to fruition. Which means I'm really good at making wishes come true, and maybe I should start charging people for this service." Rose laughed despite herself. "Ruby, you can't charge people for wish fulfillment." "Why not? I reunited you and Daddy. I'm getting the little brother I asked for, and I made our family complete." "That's pretty impressive work for someone who's still in second grade." "You have a point," Chris said solemnly, though his smile betrayed his amusement. As evening approached, they settled into their bedtime routine, a family ritual that had evolved naturally over the months, each part as essential as breathing. Chris read stories while Rose braided Ruby's hair, both of them taking turns answering Ruby's endless questions about everything from why grass was green to how babies grew to whether love was something you could see if you looked hard enough. "Daddy?" Ruby asked as Chris tucked her into bed. "Yes, sweetheart? Do you ever miss the time before you knew about me?" The question was asked with casual curiosity, but Chris heard the deeper concern underneath. Ruby still sometimes worried that she was a complication rather than a gift, despite months of evidence to the contrary. "Never," Chris said firmly. "Not for 1 second. My life didn't really start until I met you." Ruby considered this with the seriousness of someone evaluating important information. "What about your life with Mommy before?" "That was practice," Chris said with a smile that carried 8 years of hard-won wisdom. "We were learning how to love each other so we'd be ready to love you. And now we're all ready for baby brother." Ruby nodded, satisfied with this explanation that made their complicated history feel like destiny rather than accident. "And now we're all ready for our family to be complete." Later, as they lay in bed with Rose's head on Chris's chest, she felt their son move for the first time, a flutter so gentle she might have missed it if she hadn't been completely still, completely present in the moment. It was like a butterfly landing on her skin from the inside, delicate and profound and completely life-changing. "Chris," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. The baby just moved. His hand immediately covered hers on her belly, both of them waiting in the darkness for another sign of the life they'd created together. This pregnancy felt like a gift they'd never expected to receive, a tangible symbol of their rebuilt love and Ruby's wish for one more brother finally coming true. "He's saying hello," Chris murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Or she's reminding us that miracles come in all sizes," Rose replied, thinking of Ruby's uncanny ability to orchestrate the impossible. "Thank you," Rose whispered into the darkness, her words carrying years of gratitude. "For what?" "For coming back when I called, for not giving up when I was too scared to try, for loving us enough to be brave when bravery felt impossible." Chris's arms tightened around her with gentle strength. "Thank you for letting me come back. Thank you for raising the most remarkable little girl in the world. Thank you for being brave enough to love me again." As sleep claimed them, Rose thought about the story they would someday tell their children, about how love could break and heal, about how families could fall apart and rebuild themselves stronger, about how sometimes 7-year-old girls were wise enough to see what adults couldn't. It would be a story about second chances and first loves, about the courage to risk everything for the chance at happiness. But most of all, it would be a story about Ruby Rose Brown Leslie, the little girl brave enough to wish her family back together and stubborn enough to make that wish come true through nothing but hope, determination, and an unshakable belief that love always wins when you're brave enough to fight for it. The end.